So my talk, I want to do something. Let me just start again. That's it. My talk, as you see, is Mindfulness, a Kindly Approach to Being with Cancer. And I think probably the best way is that if there are any confusions or lack of understanding, perhaps something you'd like me to explain better as we're going along, please interrupt. I'll make sure there's time at the end that we can discuss things a little bit. But if you have anything you want me to clarify, then sing out. That would be great. So just a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to share with you. I want particularly to share with you something around mindfulness-based approaches, because I think it's an extraordinary revolution, you might almost say, that's happening. And I don't know how much that's clear to you all. So I want to just share little snippets of that. I want to talk with you about this map that we've developed. Ursula Bates is somebody who's been here standing in this place, I think 3 years ago, giving a talk at one of Lara Bling's forums. And she and I developed this particular approach. So I want to share with you something about that. What will really come alive is some of the stories of people who've used this approach in the context of cancer. And I want to guide a few short practices, which feels quite brave. But equally, I think you need to have a taste and experience for yourself how this might land with you. And then there's a poem at the end. So just to ask you, how many of you are well aware of the development of mindfulness-based approaches, both in clinical and non-clinical settings? Okay, I reckon about half of you. Okay, yeah. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of a taste for those of you who are not so aware. So Jon Kabat-Zinn was attending a retreat in America, and it was a Satipatthana Sutra retreat. And in fact, it was taught by Christina Feldman, who I know very well. And one night, I'm probably embroidering the story a little bit, but why not? One night, he had this real inspiration that he could actually use and be inspired by the Satipatthana Sutra and actually transform it into a course for ordinary people who wouldn't necessarily be interested in Buddhism, but who perhaps were troubled and suffering, as we know ordinary people, all of us, do. And so he started his first course. He was a molecular biologist. I mean, he's been here, standing here, I think, at least twice. So you've met him. I mean, he's a very special guy. And he has, I think, a particular connection with Rigpa. He must do, because he's come to 4 of your events, and that's a lot for Jon Kabat-Zinn, because he's an incredibly busy guy. So in 1979, he led his first course in the hospital of Massachusetts. And he opened the doors, really, to anybody, people with heart conditions, people with chronic health conditions, people with anxiety. But he called it, which was brilliant, he called it mindfulness-based stress reduction. And it was a secular course for 8 weeks, 2 hours a week. And stress, of course, has no stigma. We're all stressed. It's okay to be stressed. Whereas being depressed or being anxious, which we all are as well, to some extent, has a different sense to it. So what was interesting was that in 1983, a guy called Bill Moyers made a documentary of his work. And actually, you can get it quite easily. You can see it on YouTube. And if you're interested in that, do have a look, because it's an extraordinary video. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And it went nationwide, and everyone, that's a huge exaggeration, but a lot of people wanted one of these courses. And so it started, and it started there. But of course, it started hundreds of years earlier. Let's just be clear about that. Okay. So MBSR is the grandfather and grandmother of all the mindfulness-based approaches that follow, all of them. So the MB in MBCT and MB EAT, various relapse prevention programs, all sorts. They all start with mindfulness-based MB, and that's MBSR. And one of the ones that's influenced my work a lot is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression. And these three brilliant psychologists, absolutely brilliant minds, Zindel Siegel, get it the right way around, Mark Williams, and John Teasdale. I have particular connections with Mark Williams and John Teasdale. And they produced Mindfulness-Based Cognitive Therapy for Depression, which has quite literally been a radical development in the psychological world. It's extraordinary, the influence that it's had, quite extraordinary. It's also had a big influence in the research and evidence-based world, because thanks to their work, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression is now a treatment of choice for people with recurrent depression in the UK anyway, and certainly this is spreading through Europe. That's an extraordinary thing. If you can imagine people in acute mental hospitals, psychiatric hospitals, community mental health services, actually being taught to meditate, and this being mainstream. I mean, it is hard to believe, isn't it? It's hard to believe. The picture isn't quite as rosy as that, but you can imagine there are some edges and some challenges. But even so, they've done an extraordinary thing, and they were very influenced and inspired by John Kabat-Zinn's work. So way down the line, nothing like the league of these guys, is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for cancer, the program that I've been involved in developing. And I've started teaching this in 2001. I, in fact, myself was a patient in the unit where I started teaching. And I'd had a breast cancer myself, and so one year I was there as a patient, having chemotherapy with very little hair, in fact no hair at all, which my Buddhist friends thought was wonderful, that I'd shaved my hair and I was going to become a nun. And it was actually a moment of, I know it sounds funny now, but at the time it was like, oh, I don't know how to tell them, Yeah. I think I should have done, shouldn't I? Yeah. And then years down the line, and I suppose I just want to say that actually it does take a long time to develop something like this, and rightly so. So for the first few years, I basically taught mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression, but removed the depression material. So removed the specific models around depression, but really stayed true to what's known as the Green Book, which is the previous slide we saw. Yeah. And then some way down the line, I was greatly supported by John Teasdale, who's one of the founders of MBCT, greatly supported. And in this iterative word, that was a new word for me after I'd done it. I didn't know what that meant, but iterative means you change a bit, you try it out, you think again about it. You change a bit more, you try it out. Yeah, you all know. I didn't know what it meant. So, and then Ursula Bates, and I don't know if any of you remember Ursula. She's a diminutive Irish lady who is brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and a superb theoretician, a very dear friend. And it really speaks to me, actually, of how important it is to seek out people who are very different from us. We tend to be veered towards people who are very similar. But actually, it's incredibly creative to work with people who are really very different and who have different styles, different personalities, different perspectives. So Ursula and I came together and we developed this model, which in this context we'd call VIEW. This was the view that we were trying to develop around mindfulness and cancer, our understanding of what was involved. And you can't see it very well, but we'll go through it a little bit more. But what I want to show you particularly and point out to you is that the circles start on the left with the circle of suffering, with cancer in the middle, and it's dark, it's claustrophobic, it's heavy. And then in the middle we have the circle of presence with mindful awareness in the middle, and that's a little bit lighter, it's a little bit more spacious. And then on the right-hand side, we have the circle of presence, and in the middle we have being, which is a tall order. But what I want to show you is just to point out to you the two arrows on the top left and the bottom left of the model. And those words actually say tightening and closing. So the closer we are to suffering, the closer we are to that heaviness and that, well, certainly for people with cancer, the diagnosis and the treatment of cancer, and the more we experience this tightening and closing. So here's another way of looking at it. So a friend and colleague of mine who's an artist drew this. I think it's completely beautiful. Very interesting that there are no feet. There's no connection with the ground. This being is like a little bird, kind of folded up. Yeah. You see there's something happening in the middle of the chest. Something happening in the middle of the head. Closing. And then coming back to the model, looking at the arrows on the furthest right of the page. So this is the closest to the integration, if you like, people living more mindfully. And another illustration. Opening. The two arrows say opening and softening. So the closer we are to Cancer, the more we're likely to tighten and close. And the furthest across, or the furthest away, the way we integrate and live mindfully, the more we're likely to open and soften. Yeah? I mean, all you practitioners here know this. But I love this picture. It speaks to me of flow. Yeah? Movement. Open-chested, open-hearted. Do you see the feet are in very good contact with the floor? And what I love about the picture is it could be any age, it could be any gender, could be black, white, could be any of us, couldn't it? Yeah. So this is the little bench outside my door. And I thought we could include this to offer you a little rest. Yeah? Little rest. And to guide you in the very first short practice that we do on the course. The practice that I guide people, perhaps when they make contact with me, if they make contact with me perhaps on the phone, having just been diagnosed or feeling tremendously troubled. And it's a deceptively simple practice, but I really recommend it to you, maybe one that you know extremely well. So just doing this if you want to, not if you don't want to. Do come and find a place to sit. Yeah. So we're going to do a practice called feet on the floor. And those of you on the floor, literally, it'll be legs on the floor and bum on the floor. But just particularly, if you're willing to, just really planting your feet flat on the floor. Some of you got mats, that's okay. And if you'd like to do this with your eyes closed, you can. If you want to keep them open, that's really fine. But just coming to awareness of the contact of your feet with the floor or the mat. Just feeling any sensations of contact. Maybe in the toes, balls of the feet, perhaps in the heels. Just noticing how the weight of you is going down through your feet onto the floor and through your seat onto the floor. Perhaps even experiencing a sense of the solid of the floor beneath you. Ultimately, the ground, the earth that supports us. Feet on the floor, exploring. Okay, thank you. It's a very simple practice, one that you can do for as long as you want, or maybe just a few seconds. One that I often teach, and I often teach health professionals and invite them to do this perhaps every time they touch a door handle. Just to pause and feel the feet on the floor. So it's deceptively simple. Yeah. So let's now move to we're just going to touch into this quite briefly, move into the first circle in a little bit more detail. This is the circle that's heavy, dark. And you notice that in the middle of the circle there's a lens shape. The others have got a full circle shape. This one's more like a lens. And I think any of us who've experienced, any of us who've experienced a diagnosis or experienced somebody who's had a diagnosis of cancer, they'll tell you that it's like the world reflects cancer back to them. You know, it's like wherever you turn, the newspapers, television, radio, friends, there it is again, you know. And just to go back, I just want to share with you the inner, the kind of middle ring. This really is attempting to speak to the psychological impact of cancer. The psychological impact of cancer. So these are the 4 words that are around that middle circle. They're probably words that you're fairly familiar with. Rumination, something that most of us do. Not necessarily all the time, hopefully. In the middle of the night, easy to ruminate, isn't it? Goes round and round. Avoidance, quite natural to push things away that we don't want. Completely natural. But both rumination and avoidance are what fuels the distress of cancer. It feeds the distress. Trauma at the top is generally underdiagnosed. I think there's some good evidence now for this. It's hard to diagnose. Trauma is hard to process, doesn't have much narrative. It's got a sort of frozen, blocked quality to it. And it's something that a lot of people with cancer who may experience some trauma around diagnosis and around treatment. Again, it's quite normal. It doesn't necessarily last. But it's hard to manage. It's hard to deal with. So just very briefly, MBSR and MBCT may not be appropriate for everyone with cancer. I think this is probably pretty obvious. It's an 8-week course. It's 2 hours a week. It's like something like an hour a week, an hour a day home practice, 45 minutes a day home practice. It's quite a big deal. It's quite an intensive experience. So if you've just been diagnosed, or if you're receiving radical treatment, you know, you're not going to manage that. It's not going to happen. It's not going to be appropriate. You need to just focus in on managing treatment first. And then something like MBSR or MBCT, if you can access it near you, it's a really good option. If it feels right for you, it's not necessarily right for everybody. But people for whom it is a good time and for whom it is right, people with cancer seem to do very well. So we move now to the circle of practice. So I love the way that the graphic designer who did this, in fact she did this I think now about 4 years ago, and she wasn't a practitioner, and I just think the way she's captured these ideas is really very, very brilliant. So you see mindful awareness is in the middle. That's the kind of center of the mandala, really. And as I think probably many of us in this room know, mindfulness is not difficult to practice. It's not difficult to follow a practice of mindfulness. But it's incredibly hard to remember. You know, we live our lives in such a rush. We're so busy. We're so distracted. We're often so drawn away to what we're finding difficult. And obviously for people with cancer, that's especially a case. They may not be busy in the way that they were before they had cancer, if they're in the middle of treatment. But there's a huge amount to be distracted by, to be troubled by. But the good news is that even though it's hard to remember, people with cancer have very strong intention, have very strong motivation. You know, they're very keen when they come on one of these programs, if they're well prepared, And there needs to be some kind of preparation process before the program starts. But intention is incredibly important. Something I've spent a lot of time reflecting on. Intention. What does this mean? This isn't the goal. This isn't the top of the mountain we want to reach for. This is like the direction of travel, the compass point. The place that we can keep coming back to, that inspires us or helps us, nurtures us to know which way to go. So people coming onto the program, one of the first questions that we ask, which I think is such a good question, is what really matters to you? What really matters to me? What really matters to you? It's a really important question. And of course the answer to that question, even if there are sometimes not really many clear answers, sometimes the answer is just like a sort of felt sense in the heart. It's hard to sometimes articulate something so significant. But for someone who's had cancer, it's not really too hard to articulate what really matters. I think very often, and this again there's some evidence for this, that somebody who's had an experience of cancer has actually some new priorities. Their priorities have changed. I don't know if those of you who've perhaps experienced cancer in this room, whether you reflect on this. Certainly it was true for me. I had a much clearer idea what was important and what wasn't important. And that's actually a gift. Cancer is no gift, but to actually have some more clarity about what really matters is certainly a real gift. So intention. So I want to read to you a little bit of the story of Helen. Dear Helen, a very funny woman. Very funny woman. And she got breast cancer, and I interviewed her when she was about 46, I think. Her partner is a farmer in North Wales. So from a really ordinary family. And 2 young boys, although they're a good bit older than these 2 in the picture. And Helen, looking there, is just how she always looked. She always managed to smile, however ill she was, however often she'd needed chemo to keep herself alive for her boys. She was determined to live as long as possible. So what really mattered to Helen? So in her words, I remember the interview at the hospital, and you asked me why I wanted to do the program. I want to force myself to face up to what I've been through in case it comes back to haunt me, I said. I remember you saying, maybe you can be kind to yourself rather than forcing. And this was the first time I ever considered thinking like that. People kept telling me how brave I'd been, but I didn't feel it. I didn't think I had the tools to deal with it all. And I wanted to be better prepared in case it happened again. Thank God I did. So after the course, and after she got a second cancer on the other side, on the other breast, this time, she said, I had resources to fall back on. I was still doing the body scan now and again. I don't know if you know the body scan. It's a lying down practice. Yeah, some of you are nodding. Also, I learned to watch myself. I do a lot of planning ahead. And that is what you mustn't do when you've got cancer. It's so easy to imagine a doom-laden future. So I pause, and I have a look around my body, as it were. And I think, well, I feel okay today. Incredibly skillful. 2 years later, she had a recurrence, and she was told it was terminal. She was given 2.5 years to live, and she managed 4, which is some achievement. These days, I do the body scan still, and the pause, and coming to the breath quite a bit. I'm still rushing, but less. And what I really enjoy is going for a walk, going with the boys at the weekend. And I think, this is lovely. and I really notice the blackberries in the hedge. It's as if I'm imprinting them on my memory. Not because I'm being morbid, because I'm quite well right now, but because I'm really enjoying the weather, finding things in the hedge, the horse in the field, really noticing. So I asked her if she had any advice for others in the same boat. I would tell them not to be afraid of living with a terminal prognosis. Just live, and use mindfulness to really live your life, instead of just skimming over it. Enjoying things as they happen instead of always thinking ahead. Leave the ironing on the ironing table and go out and play with the children. Yeah. So, a little small mountain for you. And another short practice. So again, just following this if you'd like to. And it's fine not to. It's really fine just to listen. But if it's okay, once more, just getting your feet on the floor. Some of you have already done that, so that's very good. Feet planted on the floor. And for those of you on a cushion, if you can be comfortable, just feeling the contact with the floor, perhaps with your legs, perhaps with the sides of your feet. And then just in your own time, coming to the breath. And just seeing if you can notice the rise and the fall of the breath, breathing. No need to change the breath in any way. Just seeing if you can rest on the breath. Perhaps becoming aware of the very beginnings of the next in-breath. That moment it lifts and comes in. And also noticing that whenever your mind wanders away, remembering when this happens that it's not a problem. It's just what minds do. But whenever you notice, then seeing if it's possible to gently come back. Coming back to the breath. Coming back to the anchor of the breath in this moment. Okay. So coming back. That's our next movement. And you might ask, well, why coming back? Why not staying present? Mindfulness is meant to be all about being in the here and now. But as you discovered from the practice that we've just done, the mind wanders. We wander off back into the past, maybe regretting. We wander off into the future, maybe worrying. Yeah. So we learn to come back. We learn to just come back to the body, come back to the feet on the floor, and come back to the breath, the anchor. So this is really the foundation of mindfulness-based approaches. And this is what Jane practiced. So Jane is a ceramicist. She's not a potter, apparently. She's a ceramicist. Got to get it right. And interestingly, she makes these little globes. Absolutely beautiful. So Jane is the primary carer for her son, who was diagnosed with a very rare form of cancer when he was 13. And he's now in his 20s. He's needed many operations on his brain over the years. And he now needs full-time care. When I first met Jane, I think it's not an exaggeration to say she was the most agitated person I have ever met. She literally couldn't keep still. She couldn't keep any part of herself still. These are her words. When I met you, you taught me some short mindfulness exercises. I tried feet on the floor on the beach, and it made me enjoy the beach all the more. I used it in bed by feeling the duvet over my feet, and that helped when I woke at night. I remember thinking, these are working, but life still carried on relentlessly. When we met, we talked about the course. I really didn't think I could manage it. It seemed much too much. But I needed a window of peace. And that's what got me to mindfulness. I had a taste of it on the beach and in bed. So it was, okay, let's try. I must do something. I found the course really hard the first time. I struggled to find the time for me. The body scan was so long. My brain couldn't hang on for that length of time, let alone my body. And that's why I stuck with the pause and feet on the floor, because they were instant. I liked the little coloured sticky dots we were given. I had one on my car keys, one on the fridge door, one on my laptop, and one on my spice drawers. And if they caught my eye, in that split second, there was recognition of, yes, stop. It was like someone saying, wake up. It's okay. Nothing bad will happen if you stop. Michael's future is now uncertain. He is scared. He tends to dwell on the things that bother him. He gets all sorts of pictures in his head. Will it be like this? So I encourage him to focus on where he is now. Is it a beautiful day? Yes, it is. Can you hear the sparrows in our box hedge? I use the example of the mind being a bit like a puppy. I say to him, your mind is pulling you down a road that you don't want to go down. He adores Molly, our Springer Spaniel. Imagine it's Molly pulling you down the wrong road. You're not going to let her. Say to her, let's go this way instead. I tell him to use this for himself. I'm trying to bring in things that have helped me, and that has a knock-on effect. It helps me, and I hope it helps Michael. One morning recently, we were walking the dogs on the beach, and we met a friend. She always asks how we all are and how Michael is. I looked at her and I just couldn't speak. Not doing so well today, she asked kindly. And I nodded. The agitation wasn't there, just this knot in my throat which stops me talking. I feel it a bit now, but I can come back to my feet on the floor to steady me. The floor never changes. It's there whatever happens with Michael. All the people this beach has seen, but the rocks, the sea coming in and the sea going out hasn't changed. So blessings to Jane, hey? Yeah, she's doing well. So the third movement is turning towards. This needs courage, but most of all it needs the foundation of coming back. It needs a really strong practice of coming back. It's very counterintuitive. And it's something that we have to, or that we teach and we practice ourselves very gently. Gently is incredibly important. It's a bit like, not something I'm likely to be doing at the moment, but bit like learning to jump, the high jump. Maybe my grandchildren might. And they would start with a very small jump. And they would build up little by little. And so it is with turning towards. We start with something quite small. We're not turning towards the story of cancer. We're not turning towards the thoughts about cancer. We're turning towards the felt sense in the body, the resonance in the body. We're turning towards that and breathing with it and seeing if we can explore it a little bit and be curious. So it's a huge practice, and it's the most radical practice because this is what changes our relationship with what's difficult. So we'll hear a bit more about this. So one of the people that I worked with, who I shall always remember, is called Daniel. And I worked with him on the phone on and off for about 10 months, whenever he was available. He wasn't in hospital. So towards the end of his life, I should also add that I've put a picture of a mountain there. Do come in, yeah. I put a picture of a mountain there because he loved the practice of standing in mountain. So that's just feet on the floor and standing. He loved that practice. So towards the end of his life, Daniel contracted pneumonia. And of course, this left him incredibly short of breath. Now, Daniel had grown up in Iceland. And he often talked fondly of the country's volcanoes and mud pools. And I have to say that I'm determined to go and visit Iceland one day, because it sounds a very magical country. So Daniel was incredibly creative, and he developed a practice where he imagined he had shoes made of lava. And he imagined that he could breathe up through his shoes, through the imaginary air bubbles in the lava at his feet. So instead of feeling panic and dread, he could connect with his body, and he could find his breath in amongst the volcanoes and the steam and the lava at his feet. And it was extraordinarily effective. So whilst we were practicing in that way, his coughing stopped, his breathing eased, and these lava shoes, which we often referred to, helped him breathe. Yeah. So turning towards isn't just about the difficult. It's also about the lovely. And this is something that I'm increasingly interested in, this practice of turning towards the lovely. And doing this in a way that just basically is aligning the mind to what is beautiful, what is uplifting, what we love, what we care about. You know, it's not about pushing the difficult away. It's not about avoiding one thing and going for something else. It's actually about holding the difficulty lightly and actually turning towards what we find is beautiful and inspiring and lovely. So meet Caroline. Caroline is an outdoors girl. She has her 2 horses, and she loves the outdoors. And Caroline came onto a mindfulness course, having finished her treatment, but convinced that she wasn't going to survive. Absolutely convinced. She was extremely skeptical that mindfulness would do her any good. But a friend had managed to persuade her, which normally makes me very cautious when friends persuade people onto courses, because it doesn't all go well. But in this case, I think it was very helpful. So what was interesting, though, was that she was very skeptical, but she practiced very conscientiously. She really did. And she phoned me up one Friday and left a message on my phone. And the message said that she imagined that most of the phone calls I got from participants on the course were phone calls about difficulty or crisis. And she particularly wanted to phone me, even though it was a Friday evening, because she wanted to tell me what had happened that day. So when we spoke, she told me that she'd been digging the garden. And after a little bit, she leaned on her spade, and she felt the sun on her back. And she heard a little robin in the hedge next to her. And she just paused and listened to the sound of the robin's song. And she was washed with content. And she found this quite amazing, and she put this down to mindfulness. She put this down to her practice. And she expressed real amazement that she could still feel pessimistic. She was still convinced that she wasn't going to make it. And yet she experienced this depth of contentment that she had never felt even before she'd been diagnosed with cancer. Interesting, eh? So the last movement, kindness. You might think, well, how come it's last? Why isn't it first? It should be first. But no, that's not the case. Because kindness has actually been there all the way along. Kindness is embodied into every practice, every exercise, every exchange, we hope. Yeah? So even though kindness isn't put up in capital letters, when we actually get to it, perhaps by the 6th week or the 7th week, and we actually name it, how important it is, participants will say, yeah, it's probably what I've learned most from this course. So a little daisy, there's lots of daisies in my work. And this daisy suggesting that kindness transforms difficulty. And of course it is, it's kindness that allows us to befriend experience. None of this is static. It's not something that comes and then stays forever. It's, as we well know in this temple, it's a cultivation. It's something that we develop, that we learn, that we continue to practice, that we forget and we come back to over and over. And we have these threads. I'm wearing one. And I have a few with me that I would love to share with some of you. So these are black cotton threads with a little red bead. And they were developed, in fact, for people in South Africa who were much affected or who are much affected with HIV and AIDS. And I work quite a bit in South Africa. And I was very keen to see if there was some form of practice that would be very brief that I could offer and that I could help others to offer to people in the rural areas. And actually 20 years later, would you believe, I've been going out for 20 years, we're still discovering how to do it. I hope we'll find a way, yeah. But little by little, these threads have been used, and they're used on every mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for cancer course. And they're very helpful because the red bead gets in the way, you know? It sort of sticks into things. And so people look down and think, what's that? Ah, yes. It's all about coming back. And it's also about connecting with others who are wearing these threads. It's connecting with others who are going through something similar. Others like me. Others like you. Others like the people in the treatment room that perhaps people had treatment with. Others perhaps people who they've sat in a circle with on the program. Yeah. So I just wanted to share with you some of the kind of building blocks, if you like, of the program. With thanks to Julie, who did these illustrations. She's from the Netherlands. So there's 3 core practices. The first one we start with is body scan, which is a lying down practice. I don't know if it's part of your practice, is it? Body scan? I don't think so, no? So it's a tough practice to begin with, but it's incredibly helpful. Often people's favorite practice. It's a lying down practice, going through the body bit by bit, yes, scanning the body, but slowly over 30 minutes. And also a mindful movement practice. Somebody's trying to get in. A mindful movement practice that is quite gentle and obviously is adapted to the capabilities of the people in the room. And then obviously a sitting practice, a full sitting meditation practice actually for 30 minutes, going through a number of different steps, including sound and mindfulness of thinking. It's quite an ambitious practice. And then there are 10 everyday practices. This is unusual for mindfulness-based approaches. There's usually only one or two. But we deliberately developed a number of everyday practices because people with cancer aren't necessarily, some people are, but many people will come on the program, they're not necessarily that interested in meditating. It's not necessarily what they want to spend their time doing. But they do want to have everyday practices that they can just weave into their lives. And so they're taught about 10, but hopefully they leave with 2 or 3 or 4 perhaps that are really, part of their lives by then. Something that we do in all mindfulness-based approaches is we spend time during the classes on something called inquiry, which is a very interesting practice in itself, but it's a dialogue with participants, between the participants and the teacher, which is a whole nother story really. But it's an important way of participants just learning how to kind of tease out what's important in the practice and really bringing insights through for them. And then there's the home practice. So there's something like an hour a day, 45 minutes a day. It's a tall order. 20 hours of home practice over the course. And the whole point of all of that, and also there's exercises to understand the habits of mind. So some cognitive therapy type exercises are also included. Not very many, just a few, just to offer people some insights into why it is we push away what we don't like, what it is that we do when we have something that we want more of. And then here's a little cartoon for you, which I'll read out what it says. So the little guy on the left is saying, "What the hell is that?" And the little guy on the right is saying, "Oh, it's just my mind." It's good, isn't it? It's just my mind. I don't know about yours. So we have all these building blocks, and the reason that we do all that is so that practice is there when you need it. Practice is there when you need it. Yeah. So coming towards the end, I'm just going to skip through these last slides, just to make sure that we just touch into the circle of presence, the place the little cultivations that some people who've been on the course begin to touch into. And one of the things I think that they feel more confident about is their practice that supports them to be with their experience. Not every day, maybe on a good day, maybe not today, maybe tomorrow, but just having some resources to turn to that helps them hold their experience. Embodied, I'm so interested in embodiment, so interested that people with cancer whose bodies really have let them down, and yet when they come back to their body and learn to live in their body, learn to be in touch with the ground and their bodies, that actually it's very steadying, it's very calming, it's very supportive. Appreciating what we care about. I think that as the course will continue to develop, I think that we'll develop this more and more as a way of managing difficulty. And finally, connecting to our common humanity. I think something I've learnt through my practice, but I've learnt tremendously in South Africa. Connecting to our common humanity, others like me. Yeah. And so much of suffering is very isolating, very blaming. We blame ourselves so much. And yet if we can connect with others who are experiencing something similar, it's incredibly helpful. Opens our hearts. Yeah. So I'd like to leave you, we'll have some questions, but I'd like to just finish up with a poem. And for those of you who'd like to just allow the poem and the words of the poem just to land, I'm going to invite you to close your eyes if you'd like to. Those of you who'd like to read it as we go along, that's really fine. It's written by a guy called Pete, who's a psychiatrist. And he wrote this at the end of a teacher training process. We often write poems, or participants write poems as well at the end of the program. They say, oh, I can't possibly write a poem, and they come out with these absolute beauties. And so it was with Pete. I came feeling I carried the world on my shoulders. I leave knowing it's the earth that carries me. I came thinking awareness of the mind was important. I leave knowing awareness of the body is indispensable. I came as a follower of my thoughts. I leave in the service of my heart. Thank you, Pete. So we just finish up with the cover of a book that's coming out in a fortnight's time. The publishers have worked incredibly hard to get 3 copies here to Lerabling, which is brilliant, actually, because they were here at the end of September. And I believe that they're upstairs, is that right? They're upstairs, so any of you who are interested, you'd be very welcome to have a look. This is a book very much written about what I've been talking about. It's a book for people with cancer themselves. It's a book that, I'm hoping will be helpful at any point in the journey of cancer, and maybe something that people can use and then move on to an 8-week course later on, perhaps after treatment. So thank you so much.